Sunday, September 3rd, and this is the afternoon session at 2:10 p.m. Okay, so now that we've gone through the entire analysis of consciousness according to the Abhidhamma, now we move on to the other 1, 2, 3 mental aggregates. So if you remember, in contrast to the sutta system puts the mental aggregates in the sequence feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. But the Visuddhimagga, in analyzing the 5 aggregates, takes consciousness as the basis and then analyzes all of the different states and functions of consciousness. And then on that basis, we move into the examination of the other 3 aggregates, feeling, perception, and the mental formations or volitional formations. In the presentation in the Abhidhammata Sangaha and in other Abhidhamma texts, feeling, perception, and the mental formations are grouped together. And what is the term that's used to designate them? No. A specific Abhidhammic term. Right, exactly. Chaitasikas. So those are called the Chaitasikas. And in a work like the Abhidhammata Sangaha, 52 Chaitasikas are enumerated. Of those 52 Chaitasikas, 1 is feeling, 1 is perception, and then the other 50 Chaitasikas are considered to belong to the aggregate of mental formations. When we look at the sutta, do we still have it here? The Nikayas, whoops, that's not. When the Nikayas analyze the aggregate of mental or volitional formations, they explain this aggregate simply as the 6 types of volition. That is volition regarding form, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, and mental phenomena. So the word here that's rendered volition, this is chaitana. But the suttas mention many other mental factors which are not explicitly classified under the aggregates. So in the Abhidhamma system, this goes back even to the original Abhidhamma texts, like the Dhammasangani, all of these other mental factors are grouped together into the aggregate of volitional or mental formations. And so that becomes standard, not only in the Theravada Abhidhamma, but also in the other major Abhidhamma system, the Sarvastivada Abhidhamma. Okay, so now we come to the aggregate of feeling. And so it said, whatever has the characteristic of being felt should be understood altogether as the feeling aggregate. And in the suttas, feeling is usually explained simply as 3-fold: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and then the feeling that's neither painful nor pleasant. The Abhidhamma uses a somewhat broader gives a somewhat broader analysis of feelings, which is actually based on the suttas. It divides pleasant feeling into 2 kinds. Pleasant feeling in the narrow sense becomes just bodily pleasant feeling. And then all the pleasant feeling associated with mental experience that is apart from the body sensation all of that pleasant feeling is called somanassa, or joy. And similarly with painful feeling, the painful feeling of the suttas becomes distinguished into two. The word painful in the narrow sense is then used only for painful bodily feeling. And then all other types of mental painful feeling are called domanassa, which I think here it's translated as grief, which is not satisfactory. But any kind of sadness, unhappiness, dissatisfaction, dejection, all of that is included under domanassa. And then the feeling is also distinguished in the Abhidhamma system according to the states of consciousness with which it's associated. And so here it's said that when associated with the wholesome consciousness, then the feeling is wholesome. When the feeling is associated with unwholesome consciousness, the feeling is unwholesome. When it's associated with indeterminate consciousness, the feeling is indeterminate. Okay, but here is the fivefold analysis. So we have pleasure, which is associated with the wholesome resultant body consciousness. So when we feel some pleasant bodily sensation, like the touch of a nice soft blanket, or nice soft sheets, bed sheets, or pleasant wind blowing against the face, we get a nice bodily sensation. That is said to be the result of past karma. So that is a wholesome resultant, that's the pleasure associated with a wholesome resultant body consciousness. And then when we feel sharp pains, if we get burnt on the stove, or we step on thorns, and we feel the bodily pain, that pain is considered to be the result of unwholesome karma in the past. So that's pain that's associated with unwholesome resultant bodily consciousness. And so these two feelings, pleasure and pain in this narrow sense, each are associated with only one kind of consciousness. Now joy, this is the pleasure connected with mental experience. This is associated with 62 kinds of consciousness. That is, it's connected with 4 of the sense sphere. That is the 4 kinds of sense sphere wholesome consciousness connected with joy, associated with joy. It's also associated with the 4 resulting sense sphere consciousnesses that correspond to these. The joyful feeling is associated with the 4 lower jhanic attainments, and also the joyful experience. So joyful feeling is associated with the functional chittas of the arhat and so forth. We don't really have to go through all of them, because I want to get to the mental formations. So basically we could just understand that joy is associated with many, many types of consciousness. Then the feeling, which is here called grief, or I would call sadness, unhappiness, dejection, is associated with only 2 kinds of consciousness. That is, the 2 unwholesome, the 2 unwholesome, the 2 unwholesome types of consciousness associated with what? Exactly, very good. It's the 2 unwholesome types of consciousness rooted in hatred or aversion. And then equanimity is associated with the remaining 55 kinds of consciousness. And if you want to see in detail the association of consciousness with the association of feeling with the different types of consciousness, you can go to the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. And we have a table which shows these correlations. Yes, this table, which shows the states associated with joy, with equanimity, with displeasure, with pleasure, and with pain. So you could see, even though people think Buddhism is negative and pessimistic and dark because it makes dukkha the central problem, but if you look at the classifications of consciousness, you see the ones with the black dot are the joyful types of consciousness, and so many are connected with joy. And those that are connected with painful feeling, the painful mental feeling, yeah, we just have two of them. Okay, now we can move quickly through the perception aggregate. So perception, it said, whatever has the characteristic of perceiving should be understood as the perception aggregate. In the suttas, the perception aggregate is distinguished into 6 types, simply according to the object: perception of forms, of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, and mental phenomena. Okay, so in the Abhidhamma, perception is also distinguished according to the kind of consciousness it's associated with. It's distinguished as threefold: as wholesome, unwholesome, and indeterminate. Okay, then as to characteristic, no matter what kind of consciousness it's associated with, it all has the characteristic of perceiving. And the function of perception given here is to make a sign as a condition for perceiving again that this is the same. So I say that the function of perception is to pick up or focus in on the distinctive characteristic of the object. And it's generally that focusing or picking up the essential distinguishing characteristic of the object that forms the basis for memory. So if I meet somebody, then I take in through perception the features of their face, their gestures, and so on. So if I meet that person again, then I recognize them on the basis of that original perception. Okay, so those first two aggregates, feeling and perception, are treated quite concisely here in the Visuddhimagga. And now we come to the heavy number, which is the formations aggregate. And so it said, whatever has the characteristic of forming should be taken all together as the formations aggregate. I don't actually like the use of this word forming here. So I've put in the Pali here. So it's abhisankarana lakanang or rasi karanang lakanang. So it has, I would render, the characteristic of constructing or of putting together or of fashioning. And then also that which has the characteristic of agglomerating. And again, the formations, the mental formations are threefold: wholesome, unwholesome, and indeterminate. And it's actually, of all of the other aggregates, it's the factors that enter into the mental formations aggregate that give to consciousness its quality of being wholesome, unwholesome, or indeterminate. Because the main factor in the formations aggregate is volition or intention. And the volition or intention is what is connected with the wholesome roots and the unwholesome roots. And so it's by reason of the wholesome volition that a state of consciousness becomes wholesome. And it's by reason of the unwholesome volitions or intentions, those rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, that the state of consciousness becomes unwholesome. Now the mental formations are divided into different categories. Let me put down the main categories. Okay, there are the beautiful chaitasikas, beautiful mental formations, the unwholesome mental formations, and then the ethically variable mental formations. Now these beautiful mental formations are called beautiful rather than wholesome. Why is that the case? Okay, that is giving a specific example, but there should be a broader explanation. I think we need the microphone. So in what kind of consciousness do they occur?
Functional.
And
Resultant.
And resultant, exactly. So these chaitasikas that are called beautiful, of course they can they will necessarily occur in the wholesome states of consciousness, but they also occur in those resultant states of consciousness that are considered like the 8 kinds of beautiful results of the wholesome, and the resultant fine material sphere of consciousness, and the resultant immaterial sphere of consciousness, and in the fruition consciousnesses, and also they occur in the functional consciousness of the arahat. And so they're not tied to wholesome states of consciousness in the technical sense of those states of consciousness that create wholesome karma. So they're spread out more broadly. Whereas the unwholesome mental formations only occur in unwholesome states of consciousness, because the results of the unwholesome what was I going to say? Yeah, the results of the unwholesome states of consciousness are not unwholesome themselves. Okay, the ethically variable mental formations, these can occur in either wholesome states of consciousness, unwholesome states of consciousness, or indeterminate states of consciousness. And we're going to see what they are as we go through. And these are subdivided into those that are fixed or universal, and those which are unfixed, which might occur or might not occur. Okay, so now the Visuddhimagga is taking as the basis for exposition the first sense-sphere, wholesome type of consciousness, which has a great amount of mental formations, 36. And so these include constant ones, which are the 27 given in the text, and the 4 or whatsoever states, and the 5 inconstant ones. Okay, let us see what the 27 constant ones are. Okay, so these are the constant ones. One is contact. In the suttas, contact is not put in any of the aggregates, but the early compilers of the Abhidhamma had to find some place in the scheme of the aggregates to put contact. And so they put contact in the aggregate of mental formations. Then we come to volition. These two are ethically variable, and they are fixed or they are fixed because they occur in every state of consciousness. Every state of consciousness includes contact, and every state of consciousness amongst its mental factors includes volition or intention. Okay, this state of consciousness also has applied thought and sustained thought. These two factors are ethically variable because they can occur in wholesome states of consciousness, as well in beautiful states of consciousness, as well as unwholesome states of consciousness. So they are ethically variable, but they are unfixed because they don't occur necessarily in every state of consciousness. For example, in the third jhana of the Abhidhamma scheme, there is absence of applied thought and sustained thought. Because in order to progress from the first jhana to the third, in the second jhana one drops applied thought, in the second jhana one drops applied thought, in the third jhana one drops sustained thought. And so the third jhana, fourth jhana, fifth jhana, higher attainments do not have applied thought and sustained thought. And some of the more elementary mental factors like the eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue consciousness, body consciousness also don't have applied thought or sustained thought. Okay. Next, we have a factor that Nyanamoli translates as happiness or interest. In Pali, this is piti, which I would prefer to translate as rapture or elation. In the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma, I followed Venerable Narada's use of the word zest, which I don't like, but it's there. Because we usually think he has a zest for life. But that's quite different from piti, which is a joy, an ebullient joy. Okay, then there's energy, life, concentration, or one-pointedness of mind. And what I'm going to do is actually switch over to, this is just listing the factors. So rather than go through the list, we could go into the next section in which these factors are explained. So here we come to 134. Now it's going to explain each of these mental factors. Okay, so now we come to contact. And it's said that contact is so called because it touches. The verb is pusati, from which we get the noun passa. And it's said that this has the characteristic of touching. Its function is the act of impingement. It is manifested as concurrence and so on. Okay. Now it's important though that even though the text here says that contact has the characteristic of touching, this is not a physical touching of the object, but it's the word touching is being used in a metaphorical sense of the mind touching the object. So I had some explanation which I should fill out. That is, it's the mind touching its object through the sense door. And so when I see this cup, so we say that my mind is through the eye, or consciousness through the eye faculty, is touching the form of the cup. Or we also could say that the visible form of the cup has entered through the eye faculty and the mind is touching it inwardly. So this is a mental touching of the object. And it is what makes consciousness and the object impinge. Or actually better, I think my rendering here is better, it's what makes the mind and the object sort of collide with one another. Not to be taken too literally, but it's the mind and the object coming together and encountering, the mind encountering the object. So that contact is what it's essential to every citta, and it is the sort of beginning of the cognition of the object. It depends on that contact. And in the suttas it said that with contact as condition, there arises feeling, perception, and volition. So contact is the essential condition for all of the other mental phenomena. In the suttas, it's explained as the concurrence, that is the coming together of the I, the visible form, and I consciousness. Okay, the next mental factor, which is a constant, invariable mental factor, is volition. So volition, it says that its characteristic is the state of willing. And its function is said to be to accumulate. And I think this is said because volition is the essential factor in the creation of karma. So it's, in the sutta, the Buddha says, it is volition that I call karma. And we speak of karma as being accumulated. And so for that reason it's said that the function of volition is to accumulate. Okay, when we come to applied thought and sustained thought, these were discussed in the Visuddhimagga earlier in its discussion of the first jhana. And so to get a brief explanation of them, we can go back to page 136, 137. Okay, so now we come to applied thought. In Pali, the word is vitakka, and this has the characteristic of directing the mind onto the object, or mounting the mind onto the object. And it's said to have the function, that its function is to strike at and thresh, because the meditator, by means of this vitakka, strikes at and threshes the object by applied thought. We see this most clearly in the meditative process, where we have like a single object, or trying to focus on a single object, and we're continually directing the mind onto that object. So I have the breath as the object, so I'm continually directing my mind onto the breath, onto the breath, onto the breath, as if, somewhat metaphorically, I'm striking at that object with the mind. And so that is vitakka, applied thought. And again, is called the leading of the mind onto the object. And then the other factor that goes along with it, closely connected with it, is in Pali vichara, which is translated sustained thought. And this is, was explained as the continued sustaining of the mind on the object. And it has, Jnanamoli translated, the characteristic of continued pressure on the object. And then it's manifested as keeping consciousness anchored on the object. And even though the explanation here almost suggests that applied thought comes first and then sustained thought afterwards, and maybe that translation suggests that meaning, but actually applied thought and sustained thought usually occur together simultaneously. And so they seem to have, when they're occurring together, slightly different functions. So I see the function of applied thought to be the directing of the mind onto the object, and then the function of vichara to be the examining of the object. Not examining deeply with wisdom, but just like continued looking at the object. Then the text says that applied thought is the first impact of the mind on the object, and it is gross and inceptive, like the striking of a bell, whereas vichara is the act of keeping the mind anchored with continued pressure, and it is like the ringing sound of the bell. Again, I'm not so sure about this, because it suggests, in this case, with that simile, it suggests a sequence of striking the bell and then the ringing of the bell. So it has some better similes. Maybe it was my own simile that I preferred. Do you know the compass that we use to draw a circle? If you took geometry in high school, the compass, they still make these things. You put the pin into the paper, and then there's a pencil in the other hand, and then you draw a circle. So I take vitakka to be like the pin that goes into the paper, so that is directing the mind into the object, and then you're drawing the circle, that is like sustained thought, because it's moving around the object and looking at it in different ways. Okay, so that takes us through applied thought and sustained thought. Now we come back to the other mental factors. Okay, every consciousness has, well, not everyone, but most states of consciousness have this factor of energy. This is mental energy, which sort of empowers the consciousness. Then every state of consciousness has the life faculty, the mental life faculty. So the mental life faculty is, it's a fixed, universal mental formation, whereas energy is an unfixed mental formation. It's present in most states of consciousness, but in some it's not present. If I remember, the 5 types of sense consciousness don't have energy. They just occur pretty much automatically. And then every state of consciousness has some degree of mental one-pointedness. Now, this is a little surprising, but even in the ordinary sense-sphere wholesome types of consciousness, it's said that there is some degree of samadhi. Samadhi is equated with this mental one-pointedness. And so in any kind of wholesome consciousness, there is some sustained, steady fixing on the object. Even if, like some of visitors come into the hall here, they bow down in front of the Buddha with the mind of faith. So it's not that they're in the deep samadhi of meditative absorption, but just bringing forth this wholesome consciousness of veneration for the Buddha. Accompanying those states of consciousness, there is some degree of mental unification, and that is here called samadhi. So it's the steadiness of the mind, like the steadiness of the lamp's flame when there is no wind blowing. And that state of samadhi, which can be present even in ordinary wholesome states of consciousness, when we develop those wholesome states of consciousness, gradually, step by step, that factor of samadhi, which is always inherent in the wholesome consciousness, gets stronger and stronger until when it becomes dominant, then one enters into meditative samadhi, either the access concentration or then the jhana concentration. And so when that, even the access concentration, when it arises, it's not arising or coming into being just out of the blue, but it's coming through the maturation of that factor of one-pointedness present in any wholesome state of consciousness. Okay. The next mental factor is called faith or saddha, and this is said to be present in every beautiful state of consciousness. So any beautiful state of consciousness, it's said, has some degree of faith. This has always struck me as a bit puzzling since, okay, we have, say, a person who doesn't have any religious faith, maybe a complete skeptic or atheist, no faith at all, but they like to do good deeds. They're very generous. And so when they read about people in trouble or disasters, they make donations. When there are people who are being discriminated against, they stand up for them with courage and determination. And they're doing this purely out of a moral commitment, not in compliance with any religious faith. So one would still say, I would say that definitely their states of consciousness are wholesome. Though how can we say that there's faith there? Maybe broadly you could say they have some faith in the power of the good, but if you tell that to them, they would say, you're trying to trick me into a religious commitment which I'm not ready to make. I just like to do good deeds when I see it's necessary, I do them. So it seems to me, I have to say that the compilers of the Abhidhamma a little bit the mind is blinkered by the preconceptions that come to them through their Buddhist allegiance. And even back in the days in Sri Lanka when I studied the Abhidhamma with my teacher, who was a very broad-minded man, but he told me when he was explaining, he said, now faith is, we say that faith is exclusively faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. So then I said, what about followers of other religions? Don't they have faith too? And he said, well, we could say that they have faith, but they don't have what we call saddha. They have something that we call adhimokkha, that is a decision or a conviction. They have a conviction, but not saddha. Okay, but according to like the Abhidhamma system, every state of beautiful consciousness has faith, some kind of faith. And so faith is said to, its function is to clarify, because when one has faith, all of the doubts and indecision and perplexity of the mind settles down and the mind becomes sort of clear and quiet and peaceful. And then its function also is to enter into, because it's with faith that one makes that commitment to enter into the practice of the Buddha's path. Okay, then we come to the next mental factor. The mental formation is, in Pali, it's sati, which is translated as mindfulness. And sati, or mindfulness, is also said to be a universal, beautiful mental factor. That is, every beautiful state of consciousness is said to have some degree of sati or mindfulness. Again, I find this a little bit problematic because, okay, what if somebody just casually like gives a gift? Like somebody comes in here, they see a donation box. Okay, so I want to make a donation to support the monastery. They take a couple of dollars out of their pocketbook, put it in the donation box, then go like this and then walk away. Is there mindfulness present there? Maybe, but I'm taking somebody who does it really casually, just quickly, casually. And then somebody else comes in, let's say, you could see from the way they're walking that they're following right step, right step. You could see them join the palms together. Then they put the head down like this for a few moments. So you could see that they're focusing on the objects of veneration. In that case, you could say, just from observation, yeah, there's likely to be mindfulness there. But in both cases, one would say since they're doing something wholesome, it's a wholesome consciousness. But it seems to me that in one there's, I would say conventionally speaking, in one there's mindfulness, in the other seems to be done unmindfully. And then the word mindfulness is actually derived from a verb which originally meant to remember. But in the Buddha system, the word sati is not meaning recollection of the past, or at least in its meditative context. It doesn't mean recollection of the past, but I would say it's recollection in the sense of keeping the present before one. Okay, then we come to a pair of terms that it's always a problem to translate. The two terms, or two words in Pali, are hiri and ottappa. Yeah, Venerable Nyanamoli rendered hiri as as conscience, and he rendered ottappa as shame. But I don't like those translations. I translate hiri as moral shame and ottappa as moral dread. But I'm not even satisfied with moral shame, because shame is something that one might feel after one commits an unwholesome deed. Whereas hiri is that a mental factor that before as one is about to commit some kind of unwholesome action, hiri is that particular mental factor that tells one that engaging in this kind of action is going to degrade the dignity of one's own character. It's going to imprint a stain upon the dignity of one's character. So I would say that the basic factor underlying hiri is the sense of self-respect, that one doesn't allow oneself to deviate from the course of correct behavior, moral behavior, in order to preserve one's inner dignity or one's self-respect. And its counterpart, ottappa, is what I translate as moral dread. And this is that mental factor that prevents one from committing an unwholesome deed out of fear of the consequences. At the ordinary level, maybe fear of being found out by others, then blamed and criticized and getting a bad reputation. And then also fear of the long-term consequences, the karmic consequences, that by committing unwholesome deeds, one is creating unwholesome karma, which will bounce back to one and cause misery in the future. Actually, this sentence here I think expresses the essence very well, that the proximate cause for hiri, or the sense of moral shame, is self-respect, whereas the proximate cause for moral dread is respect for others, or I would say concern about the opinions of others. And then a person rejects evil through the sense of shame out of respect for himself, and he rejects evil through moral dread out of respect for another. The contrast is between the daughter of a good family and a courtesan. I don't quite see where that comes in. Okay, so anyway, we have these two factors, and these two factors are also said to be universal, beautiful mental factors. So these two are present in all beautiful states of consciousness. So there are 4 mental factors that are present in all beautiful states of consciousness. Faith, mindfulness, moral shame, and moral dread. Okay, now we come to the roots, the good roots. So here we have non-greed, which is not just the absence of greed, but it's a particular mental factor which is responsible for one's giving up of greed or abstaining from submission to greed. It's the mental factor that prevents one from yielding to greed. And then non-greed can take on more positive forms. It could take on the form of renunciation, that is, giving up possessions and belongings, even giving up the worldly life to enter the life of renunciation. And also it can be manifest in living a simple life of contentment, and also in generosity. What motivates one to give to others will be the sense of non-greed. And then non-hatred is also not just the absence of hatred, but is that factor which restrains one from hatred, which sort of blocks off the tendency to yield to hatred and become angry or vehement or wrathful, or to feel resentment towards others. And then as non-hatred takes on more positive manifestations, it becomes metta, or loving kindness. And then similarly, non-delusion is not simply the absence of delusions, but non-delusion is identified with wisdom or insight, that which penetrates things according to their real nature. Okay, so these are the three wholesome roots: non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. Okay, then we come to a whole bundle of mental factors, each of which is presented in a pair. So we start off with tranquility of the body, and then tranquility of the citta. The body here is kaya, so this would be kaya passaddhi, tranquility of the body, and then this is citta passaddhi, tranquility of the mind. And the commentators explain that body here is the body of the three mental aggregates, that is feeling, perception, and the mental formations. I don't know if that was the original intent, but that is the way the commentators explain it. And so this tranquility of body and consciousness, they have the characteristic of quieting or causing to subside disturbance of the citta, of the mind, and of the mental factors. So they crush disturbance of the mental body and the consciousness, and they're manifested as Jnanamoli had inactivity, which I don't think is good. Rather, I would say non-agitation, and manifested as a kind of coolness of the mental body and the citta. And they are opposed to restlessness, to the defilement of restlessness especially. So that is tranquility. Then the next one is called lightness. This is lightness of the mental body and of the citta, the mind. And this is said to have the characteristic of quieting or removing heaviness in the mind and the body of mental factors. And it's opposed to the defilement of, he has stiffness and torpor. This is also translated sloth and torpor, or dullness and drowsiness. So when there's sloth and torpor, then the mind gets heavy, dull and heavy. And this pair of mental factors cause the mind to be light and buoyant. Okay, the next pair is called malleability of the citta and the associated mental factors, and it is opposed to rigidity or stiffness in the mind. And stiffness is especially associated with views and with conceit, like holding to one's views rigidly, not being flexible with regard to one's views, and then being stiff with pride. And so when we have this pair of malleable mental factors, then the mind becomes flexible, soft, malleable, and humble. The next pair is wieldiness of the body and of the citta. So they have the characteristic of quieting unwieldiness in the mental body and in the citta. And they make the mind wieldy so that one is able to adapt the mind, to utilize the mind for various purposes. I'm just going to go through these, are quite a lot. So then we have proficiency of the mental body and of consciousness. So this has the characteristic of healthiness that removes unhealthiness of the mental body and of consciousness. And it's opposed to lack of faith, which causes unhealthiness in the mental body and in consciousness. Then I think this is the last pair here. This is called rectitude, or righteousness of the mental factors and of consciousness. So this is uprightness, or we could say honesty or straightness of the mind and the mental factors. And its function is to crush, he uses this difficult word, tortuousness. So I would say deviousness or deceitfulness. So it removes those, and it's manifested as non-crookedness, and it's opposed to deceit and fraud. Actually, there are a few more wholesome mental factors to go, or beautiful mental factors to go through, and it's 3:10. So let us take a break now and then come back to these. You find this mentally exhausting. One of the mental factors that's missing here is mental exhaustion.